Good morning and welcome to the launch of RIAA's Responsible Investment Consumer Study for 2022, From Values to Riches. My name's Estelle Parker. I'm the Executive Manager of Programs here at RIAA, and I'm chairing this launch today from just near where the Yarra River meets the Merri Creek here in Melbourne. This is Wurundjeri country, and according to the Wurundjeri calendar, the month of March is eelk season or eel season. This is where the Yarra River is becoming muddier. There are short-finned eels migrating downstream towards the sea, and these eels are ready to harvest. And also during eelk season, the Canopa star, called in Woiwurrung language Loantuka, which is the second brightest star in the sky, is seen at its highest position in the south. I'd like to pay my respects to all of those who've looked after Wurundjeri waters and lands throughout many, many eelk seasons and extend those respects to all First Nations elders, past and present. Now, before we get started, I wanted to let you know that quite a number of issues we'll be discussing today are actually going to be interrogated in great depth at the Responsible Investment Conference in Sydney in early April. We've put together an incredible program. It includes highly relevant sessions, really relevant to anyone interested in consumer views and how to harness responsible investment opportunities. So we're going to have sessions on greenwashing, on net zero, active ownership versus divestment, diversity and inclusion, nature. There's something for everyone. We'll have responsible investment for beginners, right through to what actions your organisation can take to become a leader in responsible investment. There's further information about the conference on the website. So if this webinar is kind of leaving you with more questions or wanting to know more, then the conference is the place for you to be. The Responsible Investment Consumer Study that we're here to talk about is brought to you by Responsible Investment Association Australasia. RIAA has over 470 members, representing around $40 trillion in assets under management. RIAA's purpose, as our members here would know, is to promote, advocate for and support approaches to responsible investment that align capital with achieving a healthy and sustainable society, environment and economy. To do this, RIAA has our working groups. We engage in policy and advocacy on behalf of the responsible investment community, and we have a world-class certification program. And we also have our research program, which this consumer study is a product of. To help you do your jobs, RIAA's research is a key way that RIAA supports the alignment of capital with sustainability outcomes. So we hope to improve understanding of consumer attitudes towards responsible investment in Australia and help you and give you the data and insights that you need. Sincere thanks to our sponsors, Teachers Mutual Bank and Australian Ethical. It's really pleasing to see our members get behind research like this at such a pivotal time for our industry. Without this incredible generosity, this study would not have been possible. Thanks also to Lonergan for the survey and the data support. This morning, we'll hear directly from the study's author about the study's findings. Then we're going to unpack the findings with a stellar panel. And please feel free as we go to put questions in the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll do our very best to answer them as we go. So to take us through the findings, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, RIAA's Research Manager, Zsuzsa Banhalmi-Zakar. Zsuzsa has an extensive record as a researcher. She holds a PhD in sustainable finance and she spent 9 years in academia. She's also worked extensively with investors, the not-for-profit sector and in consulting. She now heads up RIAA's research program and she co-authored this year's consumer study report From Values to Riches. Thank you very much, Zsuzsa.
Thanks, Estelle, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're really excited to share our key findings of the consumer research study that we conducted this year in Australia. So first off, just as sort of typical, I wanted to talk about the study and how we're going to interpret the results. So we had 1,098 respondents. There was an online survey that was conducted between January 14th and 23rd. We surveyed over a population of Australians over 18. We deliberately wanted different generations to be represented equally or more or less in line, I guess, with the population and the census. We deliberately wanted all states and territories to be represented as well. We teamed up with Lonergan, who delivered the research on our behalf. And basically, this is the characteristics of the sample size that we had. 50% female, 49% male, 1% non-binary. The interesting thing about the generations, we'll talk a lot more about generation and the different gender issues as they relate to responsible investment. And on the little map, you also see the breakdown between capital cities and regional areas in Australia. Next slide, please. So one of the first questions, of course, that we asked was to get an idea of what people's awareness and knowledge of responsible investing is and how it has changed over the last years. So we see quite an impressive growth here amongst those that are familiar with responsible investing. So you'll see the 2022 data in green and the 2020 data in blue there. Yeah, so this is really important for us so that we can track that people have the right sort of understanding of responsible investment. And we had in our survey a number of questions that probe in that direction. Also notable is the decrease in those that are not familiar with responsible investing. So we are really seeing that the population in general is becoming a lot more familiar and a lot more engaged with this topic. Next slide, please. So how are people currently investing? So these are the current investment trends. On the left-hand side is the proportion of Australians with responsible investments in January 2022, and those that are planning to invest responsibly in the next 5 years. On the right-hand side is a generational breakdown of those that are currently investing responsibly. So I think overall, these two figures show that we are seeing a sophistication of Australian consumers around understanding responsible investment, and they appear to be more empowered when it comes to engaging with their investments. So on the one hand, I think we can conclude that the Australian population is listening. They hear us when we tell them that responsible investments perform well and they can outperform non-responsible investments. And when I say that they're listening to us, I don't just mean RIAA, but also they're listening to their super funds, their banks, and the media as well, of course. We also know that they are reacting to what they believe is right and important. We see that we're seeing an increase in those that are investing responsibly and those that seek to invest responsibly. So a quarter of the population is considering investing in responsible investment in the next 12 months. So one thing that I will return to periodically as I present the study is the question, is the industry ready for this? And if you're working for a super fund or an ethical bank, I want you to reflect on your organization. Is your organization accommodating these Australian consumers? On the right-hand side then is the graph that shows the generational differences between those that invest responsibly. And obviously we see a difference here. We see millennials and Gen X as being the generation that is seeking to invest or investing responsibly. Whereas we don't really see baby boomers and Gen Z, probably because of their limitations, I guess, in terms of investments. So the graph really shows which investors invest responsibly. And so I asked, are there investment and banking products on offer that cater to the needs of these generations? Are banks and super funds and others diversifying and marketing to target these different generations? When we know that millennials and Gen Xers are saving up towards a home deposit, and we know that baby boomers, half of those have already basically cashed in their super already. Do we have products that cater to Gen Z who are just starting out on their sort of financial and banking practices? Next slide, please. So we see an overwhelming expectation by the general population that their investment is done responsibly. We see that women in general are more likely to expect that their money is invested responsibly compared to men. But we also see that almost twice as many men invest responsibly as women, which is the bottom figure. So two things here, I guess, is this notion of the expectation. Okay, so generally people do expect that this is all sort of happening and it's all following these responsible investment principles. We see that women care more, but we also see that women aren't as active as men are. Maybe this has something to do with generally that women aren't as engaged in the financial issues of their families or their personally as the men. But I also think again here that there is this gender difference that we see, and we'll talk about a little bit more later as well. And again, they're really organizations, or they're really products that are marketed differently to the different genders. Next up is this very interesting finding. Did you know that people who actually try to save more if they knew that their investments made a positive impact in the world? Well, I didn't know this before doing this research, and it is somewhat perplexing to me, but actually year on year, we find that Australians, as well as citizens in other countries, also say that they will. So without jumping into major conclusions, perhaps if you think about how ordinary people with ordinary means have a desire to help others outside their communities, you might not be surprised, because there are limitations as to how people can make a positive impact in the world based on where they live, how much time they have on their hands to do volunteering and so forth. So here we are, people are actually would be motivated to save more if they knew their investments would make a positive difference. Next up is sort of a finding that reiterates that consumers are listening and reading the news and care about their investments. We also see that they care enough to act. So almost 3/4 of Australians would consider moving to another provider if they found out that their current investments were not consistent with their values. And when it comes to which investments they think should be invested responsibly, the top 3 are their super funds, their savings, and their bank accounts, followed by their investments in shares. So essentially, they are focusing their attention to these the most. And again, I guess not surprisingly, although the numbers are quite impressive, that greenwashing is a huge concern for Australians. So 72% of Australian population are concerned that responsible investors engage in greenwashing. And 3/4 of Australians say would be more likely to invest in responsible investment products that have been independently certified or labeled. So the little table in the middle breaks down those that have said that they're concerned about responsible investment providers engaging in greenwashing. And we see quite a high proportion of those, whether they're already investing in responsibly, they're concerned. If they're considering investing responsibly, even more so, it's more likely that they're concerned about greenwashing. But it's high across all the different knowledge and awareness around RI and practices around responsible investments. It seems that it's most likely to stop the concern around greenwashing is going to stop those that are considering investing responsibly. So that's a huge cause for issues or concern. And those players that have certified or labeled products should probably want to think about how they can better communicate this to prospective individual investors. We always ask questions around barriers. It's really important for us to understand whether it's consumers or it's the investment community, what the barriers are to engaging more in responsible investments. So we ask separately around super funds and banks here. So in here you see the top barriers, basically anything over 50% response rate. So top of the line, of course, is lack of independent information. So this directly links in with the previous slides and those findings. Lack of credible options also as well. These are the top issues. We see then some differentiation between how people relate to super funds and banks. So for super funds, there's lack of time to look at options, the belief that it's too expensive, it's just too hard to switch. Those are the main concerns. Whereas for banks, the cost that such banking practices will cost more, and a lack of trust seem to be the biggest barriers. This table summarizes the top 5 issues that Australians are increasingly concerned about. So we see a huge increase from 64% in 2020 up to 74%. Particularly around social issues, we see a huge growth. And of course, we know what's going on in the world today. COVID-19 pandemic, destruction of cultural heritage sites, and bushfires, floods, and so forth. And we see that these things are reflected in consumers' awareness. Interestingly, regardless of generation, the top issue that people think about when they're investing is renewable energy and energy efficiency, healthcare, public health, and medical products. So that's across the board. Then when we go down to the next 3, 4, 5, so the top 3, 4, 5 issues, there we see a bit of differentiation between the generations. We see zero waste and circular economy, which we focused on specifically this year, are more of a concern for the younger generation. But we see that issues around water, sustainable water management, health river ecosystems are, again, issues across the board, quite understandably so. So I just circled those so that you can see it easier. Next up, we asked specific questions around climate change engagement and what are the expectations of consumers. And we find that 5 in 6 Australians believe it's important that their super fund or bank commits to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Specifically, we asked all these different strategies, as well as strategies around commitment to biodiversity and Indigenous heritage, cultural heritage. And we see, some phenomenal numbers that I would say are basically, it's a mandate to act. Okay, so 84% agree on committing to reducing emissions, 83% for setting targets, 81% to pledge to achieve net zero, 83% to commit to protecting biodiversity, and 81% to commit to protecting Indigenous cultural heritage. So, I mean, really my message is, this is what consumers think. You've got this data, it's available for anyone to use, to convince your boards, to convince leadership and management to really be serious and to come up with these commitments, because that's exactly what consumers want and expect. Next up is a slide that deals much more in depth around which specific issues, social and environmental issues, consumers care about. So we have 2 headline findings here that 2/3 of Australians want to avoid animal cruelty testing and animal products. And nearly 2/3 of Australians want to avoid investment that violate human rights. So I sort of use the little arrows just to highlight that the orange dots and the orange arrows point to those related to animal rights issues, and the little pink arrows are about the human rights or linked to human rights. So we introduced the category of violations of the rights of Indigenous people this year in our study, which is why it has a little asterisk on there as well. And we also separated out animal products as well. What is really surprising here is that if I compare this to the findings of our Responsible Investment Benchmark report from last September, we see that the products that are used by the investment community really don't meet up with consumer expectations here. So only 32% of investment providers offer products that are labeled or are basically not necessarily labeled, but communicated, okay, as avoiding animal cruelty testing and animal products. And only 39% of responsible investment providers offer products that are labeled as avoiding human rights issues. So that misalignment, we highlighted in that report, and we see this again amongst our consumers. Next slide, please. So 4 out of 5 Australians would like their super fund or investment provider to communicate the impacts their investment is having on the planet, including how super funds vote on ESG issues. So if you think that consumers are satisfied with the information you provide them, you might want to think again. 4 out of 5 consumers want you to tell them what impact their investment has on the planet. But are consumers happy with what they're getting on their websites, for example? Well, it doesn't really seem so, because only 45% Australians agreed that websites are useful, and only 8% agreed strongly with the statement. More than half of consumers said they don't receive information about their bank or super fund's responsible investment. So if you're a super fund and you find it difficult to convince your board to disclose ESG voting, you may want to take note that 75% of Australians want to know how their super voted on ESG issues at board meetings, and 73% want to know how you intend to vote as well. Next up is, we had separate questions asking around financial advisors, and quite striking that the number one expectations in 2022 of financial advisors is to be knowledgeable about responsible investment. So this is not only a huge growth, but it actually overtook investment returns for the first time this year. So we see a strong demand for financial advisors to upskill and to show not only that they're familiar with responsible investment, but also they can direct individuals to products, appropriate products, and explain these products and the value of certification. So very sophisticated knowledge around responsible investment. And our last slide is really a showcase of the key findings from the report with the little icons to match as well. Obviously, we have a lot more detail in the report. I encourage you to download the report to have a look. Our RIAA research is always available to anyone freely on our website. So I encourage to have a look and see, find the answers to your questions. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Zsuzsa. Such fascinating insights that this report holds. I'm just wondering, Zsuzsa, there was a question in the chat, in the Q&A function, asking to clarify what we mean by consumers. Perhaps you could go through with us now.
Yeah, sure. So I just saw that right now as it flashed up. I have too many screens open. Yeah, so consumers, I guess we have used the term consumer study for a number of years. It is basically all Australian. So it's a general population research that we conduct. So I use the term consumers interchangeably with the Australian population. So note that even though we asked over 1,000 people, those responses were actually extrapolated to with the census data from 2016. So we're able to make inferences based on the survey on what the population thinks.
Great. Thank you so much, Zsuzsa, and congratulations on an excellent report. Now, to answer a question that's come through the chat, yes, we'll be making this recording available after this event, and also the figures are all and the findings are all in the report. Now let's delve into them with our panel, our stellar panel, and don't forget to use the chat or Q&A function if you have any questions. So joining Zsuzsa from RIAA is RIAA's CEO, Simon O'Connor. Simon has extensive experience as an economic advisor, investment analyst, and sustainability consultant across the finance, corporate, and not-for-profit sectors. He co-chaired the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative Steering Committee, and he's currently chair of the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. We also have joining us Corinne Millet, Head of Socially Responsible Banking at Teachers Mutual Bank, which has over 220,000 members and $10 billion in assets serving the education, emergency services, and health sectors. Corinne has over 25 years' experience across the corporate, policy and NGO sectors, both in Australia and internationally, including at the Climate Institute, Westfield, Mirvac, and the European Renewable Energy Council. And Maria Loyetz is also with us. She's Chief Customer Officer at Australian Ethical Investments, where she's responsible for Australian ethical sales, marketing and customer experience. She has more than 20 years' experience in strategic marketing and customer experience roles including at Neobank Vault, Society One, AMP, Optus and Virgin. Welcome all. Now, I might just start with a broad question to all of you. Zhuzha's just taken us through the study's high-level results. Perhaps you can highlight yourselves what stood out most to you out of these findings. Maria, I might ask you to go first.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everybody. So I think it was really clear from the research that consumers, really want to align their investments with their values. And I think probably the issue is that many ESG portfolios are still invested in kind of legacy economy companies because they're only considering the ESG as risk factors rather than excluding sectors or stocks based on values. And that's probably the real difference for me between ESG and ethical funds who are looking at the broader ramifications to real positive impact rather than looking at the kind of financial implications of ESG. And so I think I think it couldn't be more evident really than this week with the kind of Russian investment situation. At Australian Ethical, we're not invested in weapons or in Russia. It wouldn't pass our screens. But I think it's great that so many super funds are now divesting, but it's probably they're probably a little bit late to the party. I think that it's now unpalatable to investors, but in the meantime, the investment community has sort of I guess contributed to Putin's economic power, but also delayed investment in renewable energy, and that may have had a bit more of an impact on not only net zero but the ability to kind of manage that geopolitical instability. So I think I think for me that was the really interesting part of the research about consumers wanting to align with their values, but perhaps the industry not yet doing that sufficiently.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maria. We might return to that Russia-Ukraine question in a moment. Corin, what stood out to you in the report's findings?
Thanks and good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's a great report. I think there's a couple of things that struck us is that, look, it's the same high numbers as we've seen before, 70, 80% across all these categories. There's always high awareness and expectations. And I think you see some of those categories jump by 10, 15% in the last period. So there is a leap in some of that data. It's not new. I mean, we've got these 89% figures in lots of ESG type reports. I think what is new is that what we're seeing is that there's been a lot of ESG euphoria of late. And this is the bill for it, which is about labeling and greenwash. 75% want labeling. That's quite surprising because no one knows what the label is or what the certification is, but they want one. And I think the concern about greenwash, greenwash is actually quite a technical term in some ways. So I'm surprised to see it's quite mainstream, but I think it suggests more informed knowledge about what a company does and drilling into it. And of course, the more you want to know, the more you're looking at it. Some of the numbers, I think you take with a pinch of salt. I mean, 50% of baby boomers say they're with an ethical bank. I'm not sure that's the case. And I think sometimes people do say, yes, have you been to the gym last week? Oh, yes, I have. So there's a little bit of sort of saying the right thing. In terms of expectations, the bar's higher, I think. But it's hidden. So people's expectations of what a finance company does is rising and rising. You may not see that in the data. And then a couple of things about the banks. Yes, there's a lack of trust in the banks more than the super. Perhaps that's got some tail from Kenneth Hayne and the Royal Commission. Banking is about trust, really, not about money. It's quite hard to say to look at that and go, there's a lack of credible options in banks because there's $150 billion worth of mutuals out there that are a credible alternative. So that kind of hurts if you're a small bank. But overall, I think the data screams massive market opportunity if you're all in on ethical. And I think that's the take home from that and with the demographics. And that the baseline for what to do is rising and rising and rising. And the entry level for this will continue to rise, month in, month out. It's probably a wake up call to check your ESG strategy.
Thanks, Corin. Simon.
Yeah, great. Great comments from both so far. I mean, I think to me, again, we're really seeing the shift, I guess, in this year's report is moving from kind of awareness to action. We're actually seeing people state an intention to actually move into taking action to move money. And so we're seeing a much more actually engaged response and a discerning response from consumers than we've seen in previous years, I think. And, the healthy dose of skepticism and greenwashing says to me that people are quite attuned and paying attention and wanting to know more and get behind the labels. So I think people are picking up pretty quickly there to sniff out inauthentic offerings. And I think what the data sort of shows me is that snowballing effect of awareness is just taking off. And so probably, the standout on that side was the jump of 28% of those actually stating they are now investing responsibly and ethically. So it's an indication that all of that statement of intent is turning into action. People are willing to move money now, which is kind of confirmed by the data we see in terms of fund flows and growth in the sector. Probably the number two one is, to me, the generational gap was stark in this year's data. It was dramatic, actually. For Gen Zs and millennials, this is just a matter of absolute hygiene, basic expectation of finance, of investment, of banking. They will move money. They will be happy to flip their bank account, flip their super fund at the drop of a hat. And yet at the other end, boomers are telling us that 60% of them have no intention to move in the foreseeable future to responsible or ethical investments. So you've got this massive divide here. And what the question I'm left with is, who are the people in power in finance creating the products to service the growing and emerging market? Because if they're the boomers looking through a boomer lens, then they could be missing this huge developing and emerging part of the market. And so probably for the finance sector here, it's for you to take this data and then pick that apart, because we know boomers probably have larger sums of money, but we know that the future for financial products and flows is going to be the younger generation. So I think there's a real important signal there in that generational gap that we're seeing in the data.
Great. Thanks, Simon. And Zhuzha, the report's findings intimately. What stood out to you most as you were conducting this research?
I think for me, definitely not so much the overall population trends, because I think that, yes, like Corinne's right, that this is sort of the trend that we've been seeing. What really stood out to me is the difference in the generations, the differences in the gender as well. I also do a lot of research, of course, on for RIAA on asset, super funds and asset owners, and what sort of products are on offer, how is responsible investment communicated on websites and publicly, and so forth. And I really don't see, I see sort of a one sort of scheme. It's always presented the same way. Doesn't matter almost which organization I look at. And I think it just needs to become more sophisticated. I think there's a lot to be gained for those that are clever in marketing their products or developing products that cater to the different generations a little bit better. So definitely a call on sort of sophistication there as well.
Great, thanks, Zhuzha. We might return to that Russia-Ukraine question. We've seen, Simon, we've seen a number of organisations divesting from or severing ties with Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. And as a really great question in the chat has pointed out, most negative screening is done by industry, not geography. So how should responsible banks or super funds respond to these kinds of real governance and social risks like the one posed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I guess in terms of what this research can help us understand is that Australians fundamentally don't make a disconnect now between their own values and what they care deeply about and their financial products and services. So we should no longer be expecting that they're not going to think about what is in the portfolio, that it has no connection to what I feel dearly about elsewhere. And so that has demonstrated loud and clear in the last couple of weeks, with people immediately go to the question of, where am I invested? Where's my money? Is it supporting Russia? Is it complying with sanctions? Is it all of these questions? I think we're seeing that every controversy that comes out now, this is not unique to this particular conflict, that there's an expectation that, and Australians are aware that one of the most powerful tools and points of leverage they have is that huge sum sitting in a compulsory manner in our superannuation or in our banks, and they want to make sure that's really aligned with their values and ethics elsewhere. So we can no longer think there's a disconnect there. And so I think people do rightly see conflict and war and invasion as an ESG and ethical related issue that they expect their investors to be considering. And I think the stepping back a little bit, though, is sometimes when I read this data, consumers will say, yeah, I don't want to support animal welfare. I don't want to support war. I don't want to. It doesn't mean that their portfolio has to have every single sector excluded and cut out, but it means they expect that their bank and their super fund and their investment organization are considering these issues, have a response to these issues, are thoughtful about the way they're interacting with sovereign issuers, with companies around the world. There's a willingness to accept complexity, but there's also a sense that we're paying you to manage my money. So tell me how you're thinking about climate, human rights, Indigenous rights, Russia, war, conflict, weapons. So the answer doesn't have to be cut it all out of the portfolio immediately, but it does need to be, you've better have a response. You better be thinking about it. You better be ready to take actions to respond to clients who are increasingly attuned to it.
Some really, really fascinating and important issues for investors to grapple with at the moment. This next question is for Corinne and Maria. The study has shown that 4 out of 5 Australians expect that their money will be invested responsibly and ethically, as Simon's just pointed out. There's that expectation there, but this is just the start of the report's findings. The study, it contains a huge amount of insights into how consumers think, what their intentions are, and so on. So, for example, the gender differences that Juju was talking about before, and how people think of investment as it relates to their ethics, differences between the generations, as Simon pointed out, younger people much more focused on investing in line with their ethics. So my question to you is, how do organisations like Teachers Mutual Bank or Australian Ethical use research like this? Corinne, would you like to go first?
Thanks. Well, I mean, we're using a lot of research to drive our strategy from ESG, from NGOs. I mean, there's a whole bunch of data out there, and we've done that for more than a decade. But it's not really been about consumers so much as the organisation, and that's how we ended up doing work with RIAA on products. I think that our approach has been to use the data to set the structural governance of the bank rather than consumers and products. So we try to make sure that everything that we find out makes the bank run effectively and to a socially responsible standard, and consumers de facto are part of that. So we're kind of trying to work out, does the bank work for all 220,000 rather than a few ethical consumers? And that's, I suppose, a difference. We have spent a lot of time on standards, maybe too long. We've got a lot of certifications and standards, and I think we've been worrying whether that's been too boring and not very consumer facing. So I think that the time's come, with the RIAA certification. We've just become a B Corp, which is a whole new level. So we're long on that. We've invested heavily in something quite technical and boring. But I think for us, the strategy about concern about what's under the hood, it plays to our favor. So I think we've really focused on the standards as an objective for the bank and how that data tells us that. So that's our take home, is that we haven't been too boring on doing lots of technical certifications, and they're actually a bit more valuable than we thought.
Absolutely, and that third party kind of endorsement, I think these days, given what we know about what consumers think and fear about greenwashing, is really important. Maria, did you have a comment on how organisations like Australian Ethical use this kind of research?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we're kind of pure play ethical. It's all we do, and that charter kind of has allowed us to be a bit ahead of the curve, probably, in terms of the kind of issues that people are concerned about. But we find research really powerful, and particularly in identifying kind of some of the macro trends. And then we kind of do a deep dive into those with sort of a human-centered design approach to work out how we can sort of deliver on those needs. And I guess, examples recently would be, launching an ETF, and, we've got, lots of work going on around our customer experience generally. In terms of the generational one, that was quite interesting to me. I'm still probably kind of, you know, working that out a little bit, because millennials have always been our heartland. And, you know, when ethical investing was really niche, you know, we had a very strong millennial base. And actually now that, you know, I think really, you know, ethical, sustainable, responsible investing has now moved mass market. And, you know, we're actually seeing interest from, you know, right across the spectrum, you know, particularly, you know, Gen X. And so probably for us, actually, we're spending a bit more time thinking about that Gen X and also high net worth investors and how we can respond to their needs more effectively with our managed fund offering.
Great, thanks Maria. Simon, just staying on that greenwashing question, the study's showing that 72% of Australians are concerned about greenwashing. So my first question is sort of what can our industry do to allay these concerns? And secondly, how can individuals ensure that their super fund is investing or bank or, you know, investment product is investing responsibly?
Yeah, so I think we should take as a message from this research that consumers are getting more savvy, and loose and vague claims in this space won't cut it anymore. You know, so everyone now in the market is a responsible investor. We know that 89% of asset managers and professionally managed funds now have some form of responsible investment commitment. So to just have an ESG policy is not going to allow you to tap this market. And so I think what's really, really important to us is being really clear on your claims, being really precise in what you're trying to do. Don't exaggerate, you know, make sure you can substantiate what you're achieving and report back to your clients on that. You know, the survey showed a high expectation of transparency, you know, well beyond compliance. So we've only just got portfolio holdings disclosure requirements in Australia, and even that's a bit limited to super funds. I would be encouraging managers to get out there and go well beyond compliance in terms of portfolio holdings disclosure. Because if you exaggerate claims, and even in ACCC marketing guidance on this, they talk about puffery and all these great terms as to, you know, overblowing and overstating, you'll be called out for greenwashing. And I think there's a risk here from consumers. There's a risk here more broadly for our sector right now. I think we're at a really critical moment in time actually for our whole sector's credibility in this space. And so this is really a call out to all of us, all of RIAA members, everyone is be truthful and authentic in what we're saying to consumers, because we're going to get called out. And we know also, of course, that ASIC is doing reviews on greenwashing, and there's all kinds of other compliance side. So, you know, that's why we have over 16 years invested really heavily in a certification program. We think it's really important. We think it's a program whose time has come for this market to help consumers navigate to quality, authentic products that deliver on the promise, and we do the deep dive due diligence on them. And so Responsible Returns, our online tool, is the key kind of resource we put out there in the market to help consumers navigate to that. But that's only going to become more important. And those standards, even if you're not getting certified, you should look at for what we expect in terms of authenticating your claims and making sure you're on the right side of a greenwashing debate.
Thanks, Simon. Do others have a comment on that? You know, there was a question in the chat about the EU's SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. Maria, which kind of goes to that question of greenwashing and how the EU is attempting to tackle these issues. Maria, would you like to comment on that greenwashing question?
Yeah, sure. I think Simon answered that very comprehensively, but, you know, I think we would really welcome the EU taxonomy has been really powerful. I think we would welcome, you know, that in Australia. And, you know, I think it's coming, you know, fast. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of movement in this space. But, you know, I think, you know, what I would advise to consumers is very similar to what Simon, you know, make sure that you know, the data is verified, and you know, I think, you know, certification from organizations like RIAA as well is really important, as well as UNPRI, and you know, B Corp is you know, we're a B Corp as well. I think it's a really great certification, and again, your responsible returns is fantastic. Market forces also, I think, gives consumers a really good indication of you know, whether funds are voting and walking the talk, and so you can check their shareholding voting record, which I think is really important.
Great. Thanks, Maria. And Corin, did you have any comments on the 72% of Australians being concerned about greenwashing? And I think you alluded to as well that they're trusting banks less than they are super funds.
Well, I mean, on that, I think that our B Corp certification provides an ability to re-engage consumers, because it's a different kind of certification that meets other needs. It has its own brand identity. It's a different class of certified companies, that is mutuals and very progressive companies. I mean, the definition is businesses, I'll get this right, so I get B Corps are global leaders in using business as a force for good. I want to get that right so I don't greenwash it. And that's the definition. So when you're certified, that's what you can say on your website. So we're very careful to get that wording correct. And, you know, Australian Ethical and us, and, you know, we're only the 7th mutual to get B Corp. I think the challenge, just on the point about greenwashing, there's actually a challenge of taxonomy. There's a massive debate in ESG about taxonomy and standards. This is a different stream than consumer expectations. It's less so for mutuals, but the dilemma of the EU taxonomy, which is essentially, here's the standard rule. Everyone wants the holy grail of ESG standard to solve all these problems. It won't solve those problems, because EU standard talks about gas and nuclear. So a consumer can ignore a massive industry push on standards, which are kind of, you know, a result of political negotiations. So the consumer and the rules, there's always going to be an edge between that. And that's why you need to engage consumers, people, individuals, and NGOs to work out what the standard should be, not what it's been written of today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we know as well, as part of the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which Simon led the development of, is a recommendation to develop a taxonomy for Australia, and the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute is leading on that work as we speak. Look, I wanted to just jump to the question about demand versus market availability, which goes to a really great question in the chat about why investment managers aren't as focused on human rights and animal welfare as consumers are. So we know that consumers overwhelmingly want to avoid fossil fuels in their investment, and we've discussed, you know, if managers are responding to this demand. But beyond climate, the negative screening approaches by managers tend to focus on excluding tobacco and weapons, whereas this study shows that 2/3 of consumers want to avoid human rights abuses, and we know that animal welfare is a huge consumer concern. So why aren't investment managers as focused on issues like animal welfare and human rights as consumers seem to be? Does anyone want to take that question, Maria?
Yeah, I'll have a go at this one. I think it really boils down to investment philosophy to begin with. Like, you know, I think at Australian Ethical, you know, ethics, you know, they're really embedded into our investment philosophy. So we automatically consider a very broad range of issues, and you know, that's in every investment decision. But you know, I think it's really difficult for investment managers because you know, consumer expectations are moving really quickly, much quicker than probably anybody anticipated. And so I think there's a few different reasons why these things haven't been included. You know, I think first is that I think everyone sort of preferred to focus on climate change because that's where kind of all of investors agree on, and you know, it's also very it's very quantifiable. You know, measurement is I think a really important factor there. The second one is probably you know, accountability for investment managers that are global. There's lots of different perspectives on both of these issues in different in countries. So you know, what is the S is probably, you know, for debate, and that can be, you know, really challenging, I think, for different investment managers. And the third one, I think, is the same point again about, you know, ESG being used as a risk management tool rather than actually being used to create a values-based approach. So yeah, I mean, look, we've been doing it a different way for 35 years. So we are focused on people, planet, animals. But yeah, I think it's difficult, and I think, you know, the measurement part of that is challenging.
Absolutely. Just staying on that issue of divesting and active ownership or stewardship, this is a question to you again, Maria, but others might want to comment. The research that we're launching today shows that the vast majority of Australians are giving the finance sector the green light to act on climate change. Now, to many consumers, this would simply mean divesting from fossil fuels, but we know to sophisticated responsible investment, it means actually engaging with companies to reduce their exposure. But this active ownership message is much more difficult, isn't it, to convey to consumers, to the end consumer. So my question is, how can investors communicate the benefits and outcomes of stewardship activities? And can you give an example of active ownership and where it's worked?
Yeah, sure. So look, I think this is it's a really complex issue, and it is difficult to communicate because it's nuanced, and it doesn't kind of it doesn't satisfy the kind of 280 character generation. But we believe that engagement and divestment are both really powerful tools. It's the carrot and stick approach, I guess, if you like. But they both need to be used sort of with skill in the right circumstances. We have divested, and we've divested very publicly on occasions where companies don't meet our charter, but we also there's other and I think as you said, a big example of that is the fossil fuel companies. We believe that that's divestment is a really important tool when it comes to those, but there's other areas that are a bit more nuanced, and we have an ethics research team. And they've had really great results from deep engagement, and there's the types of engagement that they do is company engagement, but also being signatories to different global and local industry initiatives, market resolutions, and then advocacy and lobbying with governments and regulators. And so they've managed to shift industries and the way that they operate. And the benefit for consumers in that is that they know where they're invested, what sectors and what companies they're invested in. But ethics it's subjective, right? So as long as you're transparent, then people can make a decision about whether they're comfortable with it, with the whether that aligns with their values. But I think the important thing is that they know that it's being considered very deeply, and that there's a rationale and a framework and a rigor in the approach. You asked for an example.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as I said, we've got an ethical research team, and they evaluate not only kind of the broad ethical impact of any of the stocks that we're in line with our charter and our frameworks, but they also engage deeply with companies and to influence them in those ways that I talked about. And a really good example is a small investment that we've got in Lendlease. And Lendlease, it's got the reputation as one of the most sustainable companies in the world, and so it's a natural investment for many responsible investors. But they have got a development. It's the Fig Tree Hill development in Mount Gilead in Campbelltown. And it's in the vicinity of the last chlamydia-free koala populations in Sydney, and it's a population that's growing. So it's really important to protect that. And we don't fund that development specifically, and we don't even support it actually. And if that development had been on a greenfield site rather than on cleared agricultural land, we would have divested immediately in accordance with our charter. But it's a really good example, I think, because as part of our process, our ethics research team have been engaging with experts, whether that's NGOs or scientists, to try and work out what's the best course of action. And we've been using our investment to influence outcomes, and we've been doing that over the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of funds that are invested in that development, but we're the only ones that have actually been on the ground, literally on the ground, and trying to really make a difference to the koalas there. And we're absolutely prepared to divest. In fact, we have given Lendlease notice of divestment, but it wouldn't stop the development. And actually, we believe it's really important to be in the tent, because we're the only people that are there in the tent, barracking for the koalas and making sure that Lendlease do actually meet their commitments, which they are so far. So I think this is a really challenging situation, and we're going to see more and more of these. It's actually a kind of wicked dilemma, because we've got a population that's growing, and we need housing for that population, but we also need to protect biodiversity, and this it could be an interesting blueprint for how nature lives alongside housing developments. We're monitoring it very, very closely, and continuing to make sure that that the koalas are protected. But I think it's an important conversation that, as an investment community, we're going to need to face into. So I think the key points here, that it's not easy. I think the approach is that to have a really comprehensive and rigorous framework, and I think be prepared to use the divestment tool, but also be prepared to engage very deeply. So yeah.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, well, we'll be discussing those issues at our conference in early April. Now, we don't have much time, but there is a question in the chat, Corinne. I think I'll just throw to you for this one. Do you think the response from younger generations may change in the future as they move towards being individuals who have significant savings compared to their responses today, which come from individuals with limited or no savings? By experience, I know that trading in a simulation platform can vary materially from trading with real money.
Well, I think the question about demographics is crucial for a bank that's thinking about where you are 5-10 years in the future. I mean, there is a view, there's a demographic on ethical. I think now what we can realize is this is the demographic on ethical. So if those are your customers for the next 10, 20 years and you want loyalty, you're going to go on a journey from them from beginning to end. It's true that a customer at the beginning has less money. A young person has less money than someone who's older. So you want to be on that process with them and move them from savings towards a mortgage and a home loan and things like that. So you want to move them up the sort of share of wallet, as the marketing people say. But I think that we have to respond to those expectations, which are very strong. I think, to give an example where we are, I mean, we're not getting thousands of people ringing us up, asking us to do X, Y, and Z on ethical stuff. We're not that kind of bank, but we do it because we want to be ahead of the curve for when they ask us. And I think that's the story with B Corp. What was different about B Corp and what surprised us was that, well, it's another certification like World Ethical or LBG or CRI, whatever, but it's a spark. All right, B Corp was very binary. It's interesting. People of a certain demographic going, my God, B Corp, that's amazing. What a fantastic thing. They didn't have to explain the tedious detail. And I think that's been a moment for us to reflect that having a certification that represents a brand for a different generation. And this areas which we're not in the B Corp world. It's a lot of very movement type people. So I think it pulls us into that community, and we're going to do a lot of learning from that and change as a bank as a result. So I think that the demographics are exciting, exhilarating, but if you ask me what a 25-year-old is going to think in 5 years' time, then I don't have the answer.
Thanks very much, Corinne. Look, we might move to some final comments from the panel and what you see sort of for what's your prediction for the future. Simon, I know you had some thoughts on that divestment versus stewardship issue. Might ask you to go first. 30 seconds, I guess everyone.
In that context, I'd say that this issue we just heard about really raises one of the great challenges for us. Like I think there's this disjunct, right? Consumers are saying we want to see action on animal welfare and human rights, and yet we don't necessarily have products that exclude those things. But I would argue that many of our members are taking great action on human rights and actively progressing agendas around modern slavery, enforcement and monitoring companies. And so likewise, animal welfare issues doesn't just mean excluding and dumping all the companies who may cause harm on animals, but actually it's about this sector getting better at using the full suite of tools we have available, such as sitting at the table to affect change, like that example that Maria's just talked about with Lend-Lease, such as doing the same with human rights, being willing to escalate and divest, but also, as Maria said, the policy advocacy piece and others. And also then secondly, that we need to get better as a sector at telling our stories of change to consumers and saying there's a more sophisticated approach that finance has and a role to play here to invest for change, to advocate for change, to be part of that. And yes, at times to even dump stocks, but I think there's, for the greatest effect of our industry, we need to be, using that full suite of tools. And in the same way, banks will use sustainability linked loans to help support transition, green loans, etc. So we're all getting better, but I think our call out for us is we need to get really good at talking to consumers about the multiple ways we're affecting change, and then back that up by the data as to how we're sort of have achieved that or not achieved it or progressed or not. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Corin, 30 seconds. What's your prediction for the future? What's next?
Oh, it's very hard to predict, especially about the future. Well, I think it's going to get, actually quite red hot for ethical competition amongst the banks the next 5 years. It's a paradox because the consumers aren't really moving on that awareness. I mean, it must be less than 0.2% who have actually switched their bank account at the moment. And we've seen, Kenneth Hayne and market forces have a huge impact on psychology, but not necessarily the switching. I think for the mutual sector, it's very rosy. It's a strategic imperative for the mutuals to get ahead from the majors on this and then be the original profit for purpose company. I think that any ethical play in the future is going to be fully digital and ethical. If you're not digital and transforming your business and automating it as well as doing ethical, then you won't be an ethical bank in the future. And I think banks will have to change quite a lot. I would imagine we'd be very different in 3 to 4 years' time. And who knows, maybe banks are going to become more like advocates or community champions or activists for issues and causes. So the future, I think, is digital and ethical.
Interesting. Maria, they've left you with minus 20 seconds. So quickly, what's your future prediction?
Oh, look, I think I've said a lot, but I think that I started by saying that consumers want to invest in line with values, and I think that I'll end with that. I think that's going to be it's going to be the trend moving to the future.
Great, thanks. And Zsuzsa?
Yeah, I think the population trends aren't going to be as fast moving, but I think the most action will be in banks and asset owners and investment managers. They need to upskill. They need to, so there's a massive sort of ESG upskilling that's needed to address these much more sophisticated issues.
Thanks, Zsuzsa, and congratulations to you on an excellent report. And thanks as well to others who worked on this study, especially Carly Hammond, Katie Braid, and the team from Lonergan. Thank you so much to our panellists for a really engaging discussion, Corin Millet from Teachers Mutual Bank and Maria Loyes from Australian Ethical, of course, Simon O'Connor, CEO of RIAA, and Zsuzsa Banhalmi Zakar. And look for more, read the report, or of course, have a look at our conference program and come to our conference if you want to delve further into any of these issues. Thank you so much for joining us.